Okay, great. So I want to start. I'm going to send everybody, and if you don't get the emails, I see Marvin here and like a couple of new faces. If you don't get the emails, then let me know of the group with the entire schedule when we do it both in person and on Zoom, and when we do it only on Zoom. Okay, I want to jump right into that. I call it the Therapist Outlook series, and what I'm going to try to do, we did something similar to that a couple of times, where I take stories from the Torah, and I'm going to try to explain them from the perspective of modern psychology. Okay, so let's start. Today we're going to deal with the very famous story of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and Freud, psychosexual development. Okay, so in order to explain what we're going to do, I think it's better. We're going to watch a movie, like a short movie. Let me just do this. And that will explain Freud's theory. And what I'm going to do later is I'm going to analyze the text based on that theory. So one of the famous models that we see in the basis of development psychology is the psychosexual development model that was presented by Sigmund Freud as part of his theory of psychoanalysis. And in order to understand that, this is not working. This is supposed to be a movie. No, this is not happening. Okay, let's try it this way. I tested it so many times. I apologize. I don't know.
Now you have the button.
Why can't I
to
do
play.
that? I'm sorry?
You have the button to play it now in this picture.
I know that I'm clicking on the button, but it just doesn't give me that option.
So it's a picture of the button, okay.
That's such a bummer.
Maybe just go to the slide before and then advance it again and click again just to see if it'll restart.
That's what I tried. I know, but
Do you have the movie in another place on your desktop, maybe?
It
No.
became, no, the button became white in a very short while, and then it became like dark again.
I know. Let me try to do one tiny thing here. Hold on. Just a sec. What if I bypass that? Yeah, I tried it about 15 times to make sure I'm not going to have any problem. And of course, that's what I get. Okay. What if we do that? And I'm going to come here. See if that's going to work. Everybody see that? Okay, that's it. Everybody see that?
Freud's theory of psychosexual development claims that as we grow up, we pass through 5 critical phases. Our sex drive, which Freud called the libido, focuses in a different erogenous zone at each phase. The phases are called oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. If our experience during any of these phases was traumatic, we might develop fixations later in life, such as neurosis, dependencies, addictions, or depression. The oral phase, age 0 to 1. In the first year of our lives, we discover the world through our oral senses. Our main pleasure comes from sucking our mother's breast or a bottle. The conflict that occurs now is the weaning from our primary caregiver. Hans is weaned off his mother's breast without trauma. Ernst's mother stops feeding him within 4 months of birth, which is too early. Ida is often left alone crying when she is hungry. Hans becomes a healthy and independent adult. Ernst suffers from trauma and develops an oral fixation. He tries to compensate for it by chewing gum all the time. Ida spends her entire life looking for the oral stimulation she was denied as an infant, and therefore develops a manipulative and addictive personality. The anal phase, age 1 to 3. The primary focus of our libido at this age is the control of the bladder and bowel movements. We have to learn how to use the potty. Hans' parents praise his attempts to use the toilet and encourage him to learn at his own pace. Ernst's parents force potty training on him too early and punish him for mistakes. Ida's parents neglect any efforts at potty training entirely. Hans develops a competent personality and a good and balanced relationship with authority. Ernst develops an anal retentive personality. He becomes an over-controlling and stingy adult with disgust for his own body and a tendency to obey authority. Ida develops an anal expulsive personality. She becomes messy, disorganized, inconsiderate of other people's feelings, and rebellious against authority. The phallic phase, age 3 to 6. Our libido now turns to the genitals as we discover the differences between the female and the male gender. The boy's conflict in this phase occurs as a rivalry with their father, also called the Oedipus complex. Ernst and Hans desire to possess their mother and fantasize about getting rid of their father, but they know that their father is stronger and fear being punished for their desire. Freud called this castration anxiety. Ida experiences penis envy. She believes that a penis is the key to power and domination and also wants one. Hans' father was very present during that phase. Later, Hans resolves this conflict by identifying strongly with it. He learns to take on a male role. As an adult, he respects both genders. Ernst, whose father was absent during that phase, fails to develop a strong sense of manhood. He has a mother fixation and is not sure about his sexuality. He also tends to be aggressive towards women and constantly needs to compete with other men. Ida, like all women, maintains her penis envy for the rest of her life, which in her case causes an inferiority complex towards men. Latent phase, age 7 to 13. In this phase, our libido is suppressed as our sexual energy is being supplied into developing life skills. Our superego strengthens, and we strongly identify with social values, same-sex heroes, and friends. Hans follows many hobbies. Ernst loves learning at school, and Ida makes lots of new girlfriends. There is no real conflict in this phase. All three of them benefit for the rest of their lives from the skills they develop during latency. The genital phase, puberty to death. Once we reach puberty, our libido starts to become active again, and we develop an interest in sexual partners. Hans, Ida, and Ernst face the challenge of balancing the sexual desires of the id and the needs of the superego to obey social norms. The development of a strong ego helps to find a compromise between the two. Hans, who has experienced a childhood without much trauma, succeeds in building a strong ego. He is disciplined at work, has a loving relationship, and a fulfilled sex life. Ernst's ego is weaker than his superego. He obeys norms and authorities, and as a result, suppresses his desires, which leads to the development of perversions. Ida has a weak ego and a weak superego. Her sexual needs are more important than social norms or other people's feelings. She is egoistic and feels no guilt for breaking the law or hurting others. To understand the theory, we need to see it in the context of Freud's famous work on the unconscious. By acknowledging that we have a subconscious, he also implied that we store memories of early childhood and other experiences without even realizing it. These past experiences then unconsciously influence our behavior on a daily basis. Freud claimed that our mind operates in 3 spheres, which we can imagine as a submarine. The unconscious level operates the id. The preconscious level operates the superego. The conscious and preconscious levels operate our ego. Young children are driven by the id and demand immediate satisfaction. At around age 7, we begin to develop a superego and want to become good moral citizens and please others. The ego is formed with adolescence. To balance the two forces. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis. Freud theorized that the unconscious will remember and store all of our experiences. Later, they pop up from time to time through dreams and associated thoughts. By revealing traumatic memories and desires through conversation, we can free ourselves from our neuroses and live a more healthy and fulfilled life. He recommended we should not strive to eliminate our complexes, but to get into accord with them. They are legitimately what directs our conduct in the world. What do you think about this theory and the practice of psychoanalysis? Is there some truth in it? Do we have an unconscious? If so, does it really store all our childhood experiences and influence our behavior as adults? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.
Okay. So let me just stop that and go back to our presentation. For some reason. so many technical difficulties. I'm sorry. Need to share this one. Okay, so Freud is Freud, and the Bible is the Bible. And recent psychology research, not everybody agree with Freud, but the foundations are the foundations. So let's just recap. We have 5 stages, according to Freud, in the psychosexual development. One is the oral, and then we have the anal, the phallic, the latent, and the genital. Okay, that's what we need to remember, the 5 stages of development. Okay, have that in mind. Going back to the Torah now. The first chapters of Bereshit are probably the most difficult in the entire Bible. In addition to understanding the meaning of the psukim, it's also very, very difficult to understand what is it that the Torah wants us to understand. Even from the very beginning, Rashi, in the first comment that he has on the word Bereshit, he says the following. He quotes the Midrash, Rabbi Yitzchak Omer. Okay, you have it here in English, I'm going to read the Hebrew. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, לא היה צריך להתחיל את התורה אלא מהחודש הזה לכם, שהיא מצווה ראשונה שנצטוו בה ישראל. ומה טעם פתח בבראשית. The question that Rashi has in the very beginning is fundamental. He said, this is a book of mitzvot. Why do I need a book and a half? Book of Bereshit and not half, but almost half of the book, 1/3 of the book of Shmot, until the first mitzvah, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, the commandment to sanctify and to establish a calendar. That's the first mitzvah. What do we need it for? All that history, the Garden of Eden, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, it's nice stories, you know, make it as a separate book. Why do you need it for? Right? And Rashi's question becomes even more difficult when we look at the description of creation. Because we can't understand those psukim as historic description or a scientific theory. I'm just going to give like one tiny example, right? So we know in the first day, God separated, right, and created light. How that's possible if the illuminations were created on Wednesday? I mean, do we know of a light that doesn't come from a luminary? Right? It's just a tiny example. I know what the commentary is right. I know, but just on the level of pshat, it's like, what is it? Or for example, when the Torah says Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, Yom Revi'i, a day. What exactly it means a day if the sun was not created yet? If the sun is not, I mean, day is defined by sunrise and sunset. If the sun is not around yet, and there's no sunrise and sunset, what does it mean a day? Right? So there's a lot of questions that we really don't understand what's going on. Let's leave that and jump into the story of the Garden of Eden. And we need to understand what is exactly that the Torah wants us to understand. Obviously, it's not a historic description. It's not scientific one. So A, what the Torah wants us to understand, and B, how that's going to help us understand the rest of the Torah, because that's the opening. So there's got to be something there that explains why the Torah is the Torah. Okay? So one way to delve into that is, just going to move this, is to look at the roots, at the verbs that we have in that story. Okay, I'm going to read the Hebrew. You can follow along with the English. I put all the verbs that either are actions by Adam or relates to Adam in red. All the verbs. וייצר אדוני אלוהים את האדם עפר מן האדמה ויפח באפיו נשמת חיים. Okay, God formed man and blew into his nostrils the breath of life. והייתה אדוני אלוהים בגן עדן מקדם וישם שם את האדם אשר יצר, and God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden. ויקח אדוני אלוהים את האדם ויניחהו בגן עדן לעובדה ולשומרה. Verse 16, ויצב אדוני אלוהים את האדם לאמור, מכל עץ הגן אכול תאכל, ומעץ הדעת טוב ורע לא תאכל ממנו. Right? That's the command. You should eat from every tree, but not from the one of the tree of knowledge. כי ביום אכולך ממנו מות תמות, otherwise you're going to die. ויאמר אדוני אלוהים לא טוב היות האדם לבדו אעשה לו עשר כנגדו. It's not good for man to be alone. I'll create a mate for him. וייצר אדוני אלוהים מן האדם את כל חיית השדה ואת כל עוף השמיים. God created all the animals, all the birds. ויבא לאדם לראות מה יקרא לו וכל אשר יקרא לו אדם נפש חיה ושמו. And then Adam names all the birds and all the animals. ויקרא אדם שמות לכל הבהמה ולעוף השמיים וכל חיית השדה ולאדם לא מצא עזר כנגדו. And he names all the animals and all the birds, but he doesn't find a mate. ויפל אדוני אלוהים תרדמה על האדם וישן ויקח אחת מצלעותיו. And God causes Adam to fall asleep, and he takes one of his ribs. ויבן אדוני אלוהים את הסלע אשר לקח מן האדם לאישה, and he created a woman. ויביאה אל האדם, and brings her to Adam. ויאמר האדם, זאת הפעם מעצמי ובשר מבשרי לזאת יקרא אישה, כי מי שלוקח הזאת. And he names her אישה, a woman. Look at the verbs, whether in the English or in the Hebrew. It's completely passive. Adam is completely passive. God created Adam, breathed, how they translate it, into his nostril the breath of life, takes him, puts him in the Garden of Eden. And from the commandment that Adam is actually commanded, we learn one action that Adam actually does, which is eating. Because God tells him, don't eat. That means he's able to eat. Okay? In addition, the Torah tells us another piece of information. Being a living organism, or human being, whatever that means at that point, he can die. Mot tamut. So we know he is able to eat, and he can die. Okay? Then we learn about two more actions that he is capable of doing. He names the animal, so he's capable to giving names. And number two, he's capable of sleeping. Right? He's asleep. God causes him to sleep. But even sleeping, by the way, is passive. Vayapel Elohim tardema al Adam. God caused him to sleep. He doesn't fall asleep on his own. Fine. Then, after creating the woman, Eve, later on, the naming of the animals becomes like a real form of speech. And for the first time, he says a sentence, right? ויאמר האדם, זאת הפעם עצם מעצמי ובשר מבשרי לזאת יקרא אישה, כי מאיש לוקח הזאת. First time that he is actually able to put together a whole sentence. Okay? Good. Let's move on with the story. Again, all the verbs that either Adam or Eve or relates to them are in red. Everything else is in black. You can follow in the English. I'm going to read the Hebrew. And they were both naked and they felt no shame. והנחש היה ערום מכל חיית השדה אשר עשה אדוני אלוהים ויאמר אל האישה אף כי אמר אלוהים לא תאכלו מכל עץ. Right? And the serpent, snake, whatever that was, I don't know, was sneaky and he started that conversation, famous conversation with a woman. We all know that. ותאמר האישה לנחש מפרי עץ הגן אוכל ומפרי העץ אשר בתוך הגן אמר אלוהים לא תאכלו ממנו ולא תגעו ממנו פן תמותון. And she explains the rules. I gave a whole class a couple of years ago, again, what she did, and she added information that was part of the problem. We're not going to get into that, but we all know the story. And the dialogue continues. ויאמר הנחש אל האישה לא תמותון, and he says, no, you're not going to die. כי יודע אלוהים כי ביום אכלכם ממנו ונפתחו עיניכם והייתם כאלוהים יודע וברא. Actually, if you're going to eat from that fruit, you're going to be like God. You're going to know it's going to be good for you. You're going to upgrade yourself. Right? That's what he basically tells her. תראה האישה כי טוב העץ המאכל ותחי את האהבה לעולניים ונחמד העץ להשכיל ותיקח מפריו ותאכל ותיתן גם לאישה עמה ויאכל. And she is convinced and she takes and she eats. Not only that, she gives from the fruit to her husband. And he eats too. I don't know, husband, whatever, Adam. There was no marriage at that point. ותפקחנה עיני שניהם, and their eyes open, וידעו כי ערומים הם, and they know that they're naked, ויפטרו עלי תאנה, and they take leaves of fig and they cover their nakedness, ויעשו להם חגורות, וישמעו את קול אדוני אלוהים מתהלך בגן לגרוח היום, and then they hear the voice of God, ויתחבא האדם ואשתו מפני אדוני אלוהים בתוך עץ הגן, and they hide from God. Right? That's the continuation of the story. So the Torah continues and describes to us what? The passiveness of Adam and Eve. They live in the Garden of Eden. They're naked. They have no shame. Slowly, we see that their dialogues and their speech becomes more and more complex and longer, and they're able to put together sentences as the whole thing. And in 1 minute, what happens? They go through a transformation. Very significant one. Their passiveness becomes intense action. ותרא, ותיקח, ותאכל, ותיתן, ויאכל, ותפקחנה, וידעו, ויתפרו, ויעשו, וישמעו, ויתחבא. All those verbs, all of a sudden, they're active. Boom, 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 boom. All that stuff. They eat, they give, their eyes open, they know, they sow, they do, they hear. Right? It changes from passive to active. And in those 3 psukim, we see more verbs of being active than the combined 2 previous prakim, chapters together. So what's going on? Why the change? What's going on? What happened? And what caused them to become so active? So if we look on those verbs, we can see that this is the story of child development. Meaning the story of the Garden of Eden is the story of a baby growing up. If we follow the verbs, we can see that. In the beginning, the life of a human being is passive, doesn't do anything on his own. Think of a baby, a newborn, right? Just like the description in the 2nd chapter of Bereshit, the parents, take the baby, place the baby, carry the baby, take the baby. It's like, right? Okay. And what are the only actions that the baby actually does? It's exactly what Adam does in the beginning. Eating and sleeping. And in order to perform those actions, he also needs the help of somebody who is going to feed him and put him to sleep. That's exactly what God does to Adam. But slowly he starts to name, starts to use words. And that with time, that primal use of words becomes elaborate and becomes full sentences. So similar to the psychosexual model created by Freud, man is described in this story of Eden, Garden of Eden, dealing with the first stages, like, the basic activities, the basic things, the basic actions, like eating, speaking, sleeping. And this is where most of his energy is channeled. His sexuality is not yet developed. It's not there yet. Okay? The Torah says he's naked, he's not ashamed. Just like the first three stages in Freud's theory. What happened then? They eat from the tree, right? And that becomes a dramatic moment of maturization, right? The moment in which they transform from being passive to active, from followers to leaders, right? Their energy, whatever is being revealed, let's call it. So just like Freud explains, it's the end of the stage and the beginning of here. I'm going to go back to here. It's the end of the latent stage and the beginning of the genital stage, right? Okay. And in that stage, they feel shame after they ate, right? And they have those feelings. Okay, let's continue with the story. ויקרא אדוני אלוהים אל האדם ויאמר לו אייכה. God tells him, where are you? ויאמר את קולך שמעתי בגן וירא כי ערום אנוכי ואחווה. I heard your voice and I was afraid. ויאמר מי הגיד לך כי ערום אתה מן העץ אשר ציוויתיך לבלתי אכול ממנו אכלת? Who told you that you're naked? Did you eat from that tree that I told you not to? ויאמר האדם האישה אשר נתת עמדי נתנה לי מן העץ ואוכלתי. The woman, she gave me. It's her fault. ויאמר אדוני אלוהים אל האישה מה זאת עשית? ותאמר האישה הנחש יש אני ואוכל. And God says to Eve, what have you done? She says, no, it's the serpent. He convinced me. So in spite that they experience shame and they're aware now, they're not still ready to accept responsibility, right? Just like young adults, right? Teenagers. It's exactly what they do. It's not me. I didn't know. That's not me. It's like it's somebody else. That's like whatever. My friends, like whatever. It's right. Yeah, I'm starting to deal with that now. Okay, I'm just starting. So Freud's description of the sexual development also were very much influenced from the theories and the research of Darwin on animals. But in spite of the similarities that Freud see between Darwinism and his theories, meaning the similarities between the human development and the development of animals, in the later stages, as we can see, there's a fundamental difference between animals and human beings, because animals do not feel shame, they're not aware about that stuff, right? And they're subjected to their urges. So we said that eating from the tree, from the fruit of knowledge, is the defining moment from a Freudian perspective, at least, right? And that's the defining moment. It's the moment in which it's the difference between between animals and human beings, right? And how do we see that? We see that also with the punishment that the snake, the serpent, gets. ויאמר אדוני אלוהים אל הנחש, כי עשית זאת, ארור אתה מכל הבהמה ומכל חיית השדה, על גחונך תלך ועפר תאכל כל ימי חייך, ויבש את בינך ובין האישה ובין זרעך ובין זרעה, הוא ישופך ראש ואתה תשפנו עקב. Up until that point, there's not much of a difference between snake, animals, and human beings. The similarities is that, they have even a conversation. Since when, a man can have a conversation with a snake, okay? But it's kind of like try to show that they're equal to some extent. There's similarities, right? But from that moment where they ate from the tree and they made that development jump, they don't belong anymore to that group, to the animal group. They become human beings, or they differentiate themselves as human beings. Now, the punishment that Adam and Eve receive from God, also we can see that as connected to that theory. Let's say the text. אל האישה אמר, הרבה הרבה צונך וערונך בעצב תלדי בנים, ואלישך תשוקתך והוא ימשול בך. Right? It's going to be difficult to have children. It's going to be painful. ולאדם אמר, כי שמעת לכל אשתך ותאכל מן העץ אשר ציוויתיך לאמר לא תאכל ממנו ארורה האדמה בעבורך ועשבון תאכלנה כל ימי חייך. And for many, it's going to be very difficult to put bread on the table. וכוס ודרדת תצמיח לה ואכלת את עשב השדה, בזיעת אפיך תאכל לחם עד שובך לאדמה כי ממנה לוקחת כי עפר אתה ואל עפר תשוב. If the description in the beginning of the story was of two infants, the time of the punishment of two adults. Chava is being punished with the difficulties of labor, the difficulties of being in a relationship. It's not only the challenge of giving birth, it's also being in a relationship. Adam is being punished with the difficulties of bringing food on the table. Infants are not bothered by that. They have their food. Babies don't ask how that food came here, who had to go to work, and what they had to go through, blah, 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 in order to put, right? They're not thinking, oh, it's difficult to be pregnant, Right, they don't know about that. Now, in a similar way to Freud's theory also, so growing up and becoming adults is something that is inevitable. Right? The baby eventually is going to become tired, mature adult. It has to go to work and deal with all that stuff. So what I would like to suggest is perhaps the punishment is not so much of a punishment. The punishment that Adam and Eve receive, whatever we call a punishment, to some extent, it's a great blessing. It allows choice and also fulfilling the destiny. And more important, it opens up this idea of receiving the Torah, because the Torah commands us on a certain life of Torah, right? And you can do that only when you're an adult. And we can see that perhaps there is a proof to that when they are banished from the Garden of Eden. On one hand, it's a punishment. right? Because they're banished from the Garden of Eden. But on the other hand, it's their destiny. Here's the psukim. וישלחהו אדוני אלוהים מגן עדן לעבוד את האדמה אשר לוקח משם. ויגרש את האדם, וישכן מקדם לגן עדן את הקירובים, ואת תלת החרב המתהפכת לשמור את דרך עץ החיים. Oh, I didn't put the red in the English. I'm sorry. We have two verbs, וישלחהו and then ויגרש. Right? How they translate banished and drove out. Okay, to drive out and to banish. Fine. What is gerush? What is vaigaresh? Go away. Get out of here. That's to banish. Right? What is shiluach? Vayishalcheu, leshalech. Go there. They're different. They're different. So vaigaresh, right, represent the punishment that Adam and Eve received for their sin. But the shiluach, sending out, how they translate it here, drove out, whatever that means. I don't like this translation. Okay, but the shiluach, the first one, the banish, which is not, it's not accurate, whatever, tells you what? That from the very beginning, that's not where he's supposed to be. Because it told, go there. This is where you need to be, not here. Where does Adam achieve his, where does he fulfill his destiny? Not in the Garden of Eden, outside, in the world. So if we're gonna continue our interpretation, see what, that we said that Adam and Eve it's a story of infants becoming adults. So puberty is getting kicked out of Garden of Eden. And the completion of that process is not a punishment or a curse, but rather fulfillment of the true destiny for which man was created. We can see another element. Lahat hachereb hamitapechet. Here's you can see that in that picture. I'm just going to move that. Lahat hachereb hamitapechet. What exactly that lahat hachereb hamitapechet? It says you can't go back to the Garden of Eden. It's a one-way highway. It's right. What about men? What about life? Think about it. If the Garden of Eden is us being infants, beginning being passive, walking naked, no shame, the only actions are eating and sleeping, right, like an infant. Then starting names, whatever, words, more complex sentences, whatever, and then become a young adult, slowly becomes more and more active. What happens when we get older, old? People go through a reverse process, right? They become less and less active. They become passive. And most of their energy is channeled to the everyday actions, right? Eating and sleeping. I'm talking about people at the end of their lives, right? Many times they're incapable of speaking properly, right? And they go back to the stage of naming things or people, right? Sometimes they go through dementia, which cause them to not be aware of shame, they're not ashamed, right? And all the social, right? But in spite the fact that stage of the end of life stage, whatever you want to call it, has some similarities to the beginning of the process, we don't see that as going back to Garden of Eden. We don't see that as a renewal or something like that, right? Somebody who's become dependent, somebody who loses his independence, somebody who's losing his speech and all that kind of stuff, and going through dementia or whatever, and physical challenges and all that kind of stuff. It's hell. It's not the Garden of Eden. It's hell. It's the opposite. This is the sword. That's the sword that prevents you to go back to the Garden of Eden. It's a one-way. Let's take a look at the sin for a second. So we said that the sin, it's in Freud's terminology, it's moving to the genital stage, right? And Adam discovers sexuality in the same way that Freud describes it. The name of the tree is Etz Hadat, right here. Oops. Or okay. והאדם ידע את חווה אשתו ותער ותלד את קין ותאמר קניתי איש את אדוני. עץ הדעת, ידיעה. It's the same root, לדעת, ידע, ידע, the root of יוד דלת עין. The Torah gives us a hint at what? What is yedi'ah for the person who eats from the tree of da'at, the tree of knowledge? What is that knowledge? Is to ladat, is to be with your wife and have children. So it's not only that he becomes aware of being naked, but it's also what? It's the ability to give birth, to have children. So the story of Garden of Eden is not a story of one person, of Adam. It's a story of every human being. Starts as a passive infant, newborn, grows older, discovers sexuality, discovers the women, whatever, until it becomes active and independent. The sin is something that is inevitable, right? It's not whatever sin, whatever we call it. You can't become an adult without rebel. You have to. Without breaking the rules. That's what Adam did. They broke the rules. Without testing the boundaries. And as long as person don't do that, they don't really see they don't really test the free choice. Babies don't have a choice. So eating from the fruit of knowledge is something that is essential and something that had to happen. And it happens in the life of every person. Without that, Adam would have stayed as an infant in the Garden of Eden. An infant that stays behind, his parents. At some point, you have to become your own person. And that's something that is a must. Moreover, if you remember in the beginning, we asked also, what is it that the Torah trying to tell us? Like how that serves the Torah's purpose in showing us that this is the opening for, the Torah as a book of commandments, as a book for a certain lifestyle. Let's call it life of Torah, whatever that means. Well, this utopian world in the Garden of Eden, or as an infant with your parents, might be very calm and very pleasant and everything, but it doesn't enable you to receive the Torah. Without a sin, there's no mitzvah. Without rebellion, you cannot accept the yoke of Torah or the yoke of heaven. The foundation of the Torah is in that covenant that a person accepts, right? The pasuk says, "Ha'idot yivachem hayom et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, ha'chaim ve'hamavet, natati lefanecha." God tells you, I give you a choice. Habracha ve'aklala, you have a choice whether it's going to be a blessing or a curse. Uvacharta b'chaim leman tichyata ve'zarecha, and you should choose life. So the story of Gan Eden describes the sin of Adam and Eve, but it also tells us that it's something that is inevitable. It represents the, being mature, going through the stages, and the ability to accept Torah, or the yoke of heaven, and that life of Torah that forces us to accept mitzvot and limitations and whatever, and a certain lifestyle and restrictions and blah blah blah. So if we say that the Torah's purpose is to give that blueprint for life, it's through the commandments, we understand you can't ask that from a child. You got to be an adult for that. So it means you have to have this element of, you have to be an adult, because only an adult could have a free choice. And if you have a choice, you can choose, as the pasuk says, "Uvacharta b'chaim," then you choose life, and you choose the life of Torah. But in order to understand that, you need to understand that you have to become an adult first. That's our presentation for today. Okay.